Hey everyone, Brian the Brain here, and it is week 4 of Creature Feature Month here on Pantheon Plus, and we've been talking about this one for a while. The big main event of Creature Feature Month. I am Brian the Brain. My co-host for this week is Jerome. You can find him on Twitter at JeromeC1985. But before we get into this episode, please leave a 4 or 5 star review on any of the apps you're listening on, Spotify, Apple Music, whatever. It's good for the algorithm. But this week, I'm very, very excited because I think I finally turned Jerome on to a Godzilla movie that he likes. We all love the original. I think that's kind of like a universal thing. But when it comes to the sequels to Godzilla, very hit or miss for some people. I'm a die-hard Godzilla fan to death. I've seen every single movie except the Netflix anime movies because those are not for me. But I've seen every live-action Godzilla movie ever made. And I can fully say that this is by far the best one that is not the original. And it doesn't feature Godzilla fighting anyone. So Shin Godzilla 2016, the rebirth of Godzilla for Toho in the modern era. And Jerome, quick thoughts right off the bat. I know you are not a big Godzilla fan, but man, did this impress you?
I think this is a movie that is extremely opaque, and usually opaque is an insult. But in this case, it should be taken as a compliment. This is a movie that for the first 55 minutes essentially refuses to be a monster movie. You get a good 5 to 10 minutes of God mode for Godzilla, and then it once again goes back into being very opaque in terms of this is not a monster movie. And I think that for so many reasons, I think this movie works. I'm not going to say you become invested in the human characters, but I think you get invested in the minutia of what is happening, and the fact that somebody is able to break through the minutia is why this movie works, because Godzilla is not the monster, Brian. It's the bureaucracy that's the monster.
Yes, that's the big thing with this movie. It's all about the political red tape or whatever legalities that Japan has this bureaucracy set up where it's like they vote in the elders, right? And it's very much like, I know we make jokes on Biden, right? But like there's almost no young high political officials. Like the youngsters in the political world seem to be the lower ones working their way to the top, and they never get voted into the top like positions. At least this is what this movie's trying to say. So all the top people are old, but the problem is this idea that age brings wisdom. That doesn't always necessarily hold true. And you realize this when the younger guy is the one making the real decisions in the movie. Like, we can't do this. We can't do this. We got to make a decision now. We got to protect the people. We can't just sit here and just talk about what's going on. We got to act now. He was the only one who really cared. So it's showing you that, like, there is this, like, thing in Japan where this got to change, where they got to start pushing the younger politicians, because what this movie is actually reacting to is not the bombing in World War II of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It's more of a response to the Fukushima earthquake in 2011, which led to that nuclear kind of crisis that was going on in Japan at the time because of what the earthquake did and causing the nuclear radiation to leak out. And it was just this lack of like response from the government. And it's not necessarily like the lack of response on purpose. It's just that they have to go through all these meetings to make one decision and then make another decision based on that other meeting. And once they have that final meeting, then they can tell the press. And it's like all this red tape that they have to go through. And it's like, we got to change this whole system. Because once Godzilla comes into play, it's like, you clearly got to change the system because you just wasted like all this time and you could have been saving lives. But instead, you're just talking and trying to make decisions of what to do, and then you end up with the wrong decision anyway. So there's a lot of this in this movie, and it's very like political. And it was just a totally different movie than I thought was going in, because I saw this in theaters. It was kind of a full crowd too. It's one of those like Lemley LA theaters, art house kind of theaters. And as the movie was going on, I can tell like the audience was like picking up and like really clicking with the dialogue because they were picking up on these little political jokes too. Like we didn't watch a dub version; it was it was subtitled and everything, but they were still picking up on the little political things and kind of laughing at it the way you would like an Aaron Sorkin movie, because or like or The West Wing or something like that, right? So it's got this like political vibe to it, but it kind of translates it makes it go beyond a monster movie and goes to like a political drama. And you see like a lot of that. And it kind of goes into this Oppenheimer thing, or halfway through the movie, they do the Oppenheimer And it's like, wow, I think Christopher Nolan kind of ripped this off because a lot of it felt like Oppenheimer on the second viewing of this movie. So there's a lot going on. But I can go on about Godzilla as a character like for hours. Like I've joked about this, but I mean, I could teach a class on Godzilla. Like I know a lot of a lot of Godzilla fans can easily do that too. But I just got to break it down really quick because I know there's just so many different versions of Godzilla. It goes back to the 50s, but really, really quick. There's basically four eras, right? So it's like the classic era is known as the Showa era, and that's kind of like the ones we grew up on in the 90s, those monster movies from like the 60s, or late 50s, early 70s. That's that classic era. And then there's this kind of rebirth era where they took time off and they brought him back in the 80s. I watched it on VHS as Godzilla 1985. That's when they brought back Raymond Burr, but originally it was just Godzilla, Godzilla Returns in Japan, and that led to a whole new set of movies that ended in '95. That's known as the Heisei era, and then in 2000 to 2004 was like this kind of era where they were making random Godzilla movies that weren't even connected. It was just getting a bunch of different visions from different directors. Then they kind of put a lid on that for a while, and then once the 2014 movie came out, Toho decided it was time to bring back their own version of Godzilla again to kind of give it a rebirth, and that's the era we're in now, the Reiwa era. And there's only one movie in this kind of like era as of right now. We know Godzilla minus one is coming out in December, so I'm very excited for that one, and that's actually getting like a lot of mainstream press as well. So I think it's going to do well here in the States. I'm hoping it's going to do more than 2 million in terms of grossing money in the States, because that was what Godzilla or Shin Godzilla grossed in the US in 2016. So I'm hoping like I think the word of mouth of Shin Godzilla hopefully gives more life to that, because I think there's a bigger audience now to go watch the actual Japanese Toho Godzilla movie now more than ever. So I think the audience is kind of like adjusting to that. So I'm kind of really
I think
excited for that
people are
movie.
much more willing to go see something with subtitles now as opposed to even 3 or 4 years ago. I think watching
I would say
Netflix
thank
and
you,
watching
Parasite.
streaming
I say thank
services.
you, Parasite, for that for sure. Do you think that that's
I mean, I think it's Parasite. I also think in general people are just because the Korean dramas that have taken off. Obviously, Squid Game is the big one, but I know Hellbound has kind of took some of that as well, and people have gotten into Train to Busan, and even some of the other subtitled movies are like these are movies that have taken off, and I think people are going to be much more willing to see something like this. We'll see if it has a positive effect on Godzilla. I don't know what people's perceptions of Godzilla are these days. I know that the movies have made some decent enough money, but I'm not sure that people are super into the franchise. So I think that's kind of where I'm at. But I want to say, like, I remember watching some of the Godzilla movies when I was a kid, and like they were just B movies. Like they were kind of trashy in my eyes. And I know that this is probably a sacrilege for you, but for me, I was never hugely into Godzilla as a franchise. But a funny story with this movie. So I did the Amazon rental, and I guess I only bought a dubbed version of it, which at first I was kind of mad because when it comes to live action movies, I will always do subs over dubs because I don't want to watch like the lips not matching. It's really distracting. But for this movie, something I found is that things were going by so quickly and so fast that in some ways I actually ended up not regretting the decision. Like I might rewatch this just so I can rewatch it with the subs, because now that I know what's going on in the movie, like I don't need to hear the or note the individual dialogue as much. So I may actually go back and watch a subbed version for sure. But I think in some ways watching the dubbed version was helpful just because things are moving so quickly in this movie. And that's not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because I think there is a banality to a lot of the first half, especially because you're literally just going from one meeting in a room with a bunch of dudes to another meeting with a bunch of dudes and maybe like two women, and then another room and then another room. And like they're identifying these people, and like it almost doesn't matter who most of these people are. And you're doing that really quickly. I think that's hugely beneficial because I think if you spend time in one of these places for too long, I think you lose a lot of the effect. But just honestly, just being able to go from room to room and it just really devolving into this parody of like we have to have all these committee meetings and all these people. Nobody can actually make a decision. And you realize that like this is the monster. Like the monster, like Godzilla is doing terrible things, but like the monster is the lack of response because of the way our modern political systems are structured. Politicians are much more concerned with how they're perceived and what kind of power they have as opposed to actually helping people.
Right, and that's gonna like turn halfway through once they realize like originally they didn't want to attack Godzilla at first because they're worried about casualties and civilian lives. But once it gets to a certain point, the level of violence starts to escalate. It's like that goes out the window, and that should have been the approach at the beginning because they needed to take him out when he was weak. And we'll talk about the evolution of Godzilla in this movie in a second. But I wanted to point out Hideki Ono, one of the co-directors of this movie. He's known for like doing work on this anime called Evangelion, which is about, I guess this anime goes back to the 90s even, but like giant, monster kaiju type thing. I never watched it, but I've heard it's very similar to that. So the buzz was when he was assigned this movie, people were like, "Oh my god, this is perfect. He knows giant monsters and he's got a certain perspective to it." But I think what really changed the whole perspective of this movie going in for him is that he wanted to make it like the Social Network or like an Aaron Sorkin movie because Aaron Sorkin is known for like that fast political dialogue, and so he told the cast to like go watch the Social Network and you're going to be talking like that throughout the whole movie. So I was like really impressed because when I was watching this movie the second time around, I'm texting Jerome. I'm like, God, Aaron Sorkin can totally write a Godzilla movie and make it like this. And then when I read the notes, I was like, oh my God, I'm so spot on. That was the inspiration for the dialogue. So they really knew what the kind of tone this approach was because this is clearly the most different tone of any other monster movie I've ever seen in my life. Like it's almost like District 9 where you had that hybrid of mixed news footage to give it the realism, mixed with like camera footage, mixed within actual political meetings. So that's kind of where that hybrid in the especially the first half feels so much like a District 9, but then it kind of goes into regular cinematic mode by the second half of the movie. But that approach to the first half, man, I just loved it. Like loved it, loved it, loved it. And you talk about the real monster in the room. Yeah, that's kind of where the whole point of that was is to get all these people on set and they look old and they look tired and that's just like the whole satire of it all, of the whole political system in Japan, and that's what they were kind of going for, and that was the message that they wanted to deliver. Like they knew that they wanted to make it modern, so they changed the whole perspective. Like let's kind of focus on Fukushima and that whole tragedy and what happened and the lack of response and make that the central theme of the movie. And I think it's brilliant. That's one of the most brilliant things I've seen in like a sci-fi horror type movie since the original. You know what I mean? Like since having that original, have that effect of what the nuclear bomb did. In this case, they kind of do nuclear waste, but still, like I feel like they did a great job. And also the effects I wanted to mention. Like the CGI at the beginning is kind of wonky, but what ended up happening is they did a scan of the rubber suit as opposed to like making it a realistic kind of like lizard type scale. So when you look at the monster and its full form, or Godzilla in its full form, like halfway through the movie towards the end, that's CGI, but it does look like a guy in a suit because they did scan a guy in the suit. So that's kind of where that balance, I think, that perfect balance between the CGI and the practical are mending together. You don't get that at the beginning because the beginning is clearly like all CGI. Like they can't really do a suit.
And that
But
Godzilla is also hideous, which I think is the point. So the bad CGI doesn't really bother me as much in a movie like this because the emphasis is on the bureaucracy being the monster. So the fact that Godzilla looks a little janky doesn't bother me as much. And I know this is something like last week when we talked about Deep Rising, we complained about, oh, the creature doesn't look that great. But in this case, because I think the focus is not as much on the monster, I don't think that we lose as much in terms of the quality of the movie. Like Godzilla is designed to be hideous, and therefore the CGI being a little janky is much more okay. But the fact that it gets better as the movie goes along, as the form of Godzilla becomes less hideous, but also more formidable, I actually think that works for the story that they're trying to tell. And I also think it's, for me, this was noteworthy. The prime minister in this movie resembles Shinzo Abe, who was the prime minister of Japan at the time, and sadly has since been freaking assassinated. I don't think it's a coincidence that they look similar, though.
Me neither. And I didn't even know that. And once you mentioned that, I was like, oh, clearly that is clearly on purpose because this whole movie's all about that. So, also wanted to note very important thing, and I think a lot of filmmakers should take this approach when doing reboots or remakes. The director got everyone, on the first day of the set to come together, and he said, "Listen, there's no way we can match what the original did. All we can do is just pay respect to it and try to do our best to make it our own, but there's no way we can always take over the original." And I think that's the right approach, because I think some of these people go in thinking like, oh, we could totally make it better than the original and make it modern or whatnot, but in this case they wanted to just make their own, knowing that. And I think that's a great humble way to approach it, and I think that actually helped the overall feel of the movie, because it feels like it's like a homage to the original, but it's totally new in its own right. So I think that to kind of change that approach and getting the cast together, be like, listen, you don't have to put that kind of pressure on yourself. We're not going to make the best Godzilla movie ever. We're just going to make the best one we can. And I think that's the way you should approach it. And I think that's a great philosophy going into any remake or reboot. And listen, I mentioned last week this movie had a budget of $15 million, which blows my fucking mind, considering that the amount of like extras they have on set in this movie is like in the hundreds. And then we mentioned like the CGI, the way they kind of did it, saves money on the budget, obviously, but because of that way they scanned the rubber suit, it made it to seem like, wow, like it's just right there, but it's CGI. You know what I mean? It's almost like as if it's a dude in a rubber suit on a green background, but it's really not. It's just that illusion of it. And it grossed 78 million worldwide. And this movie did actually, like in the Japanese, like Academy Awards, quote unquote, it actually won Best Movie. So this movie does have like, cachet to it. You know what I mean? And I wish that it was more recognized in the Oscars, and I didn't get nominated for Best Foreign Movie, and I don't even know who or what was nominated that year, but I can clearly tell you that they missed out. And I think it's that, oh, it's like a Godzilla movie. We're not going to nominate a Godzilla movie. But I think in this case, they missed the boat. And I think this is one of the most underrated movies to come out in the 2010s. I think it's one.
I think
I
that's
don't
a
think
fair
it's overlooked.
assessment.
I don't
think
think it's
this is
overlooked,
underrated.
but I definitely think it's one of the most underrated in the 2010s for sure, just because of the different approach. So the movie starts out, obviously, they're in the water. There's this Tokyo Bay. There's like this, this thing that's like in the water, and they don't know what's going on. Of course, the government's trying to figure out what's going on and coming up with the wrong answer every time. And once they start noticing it's a giant sea monster, at first they're like, no, it can't be a giant sea creature. And of course, the person that does suggest that is that young politician named Yaguchi. And he's just the one like speaking like, realistic terms. Like, this could be a big, like, giant sea creature that we need to take out. We need to take this seriously. And they completely ignore it. And then, of course, once they realize it's a creature, they're like, can it walk? It looks like it has legs. And then their scientists come up with this answer like, nah, it's not going to walk on land. Next thing you know, it's walking on land. So I just love that quick cut. Anytime there's like that trope of like, nah, we don't need that. And all of a sudden you cut it and you cut to the next scene. It's like, oh yeah, you did need that. So I love the way that they cut the opening kind of sequences together with those kind of like jokes kind of layered to it. And then, of course, we notice it starts evolving, which is the first time ever that we've seen this in any Godzilla movie. I know this, like, what did you know that it was like going to be like this when you came into the movie, or you just thought Godzilla was going to be there in its full form right off the bat?
I unfortunately had seen a picture of the Godzilla at some point. What I did not know was that Godzilla was going to evolve. I thought the hideous version of Godzilla was the whole movie. So I don't know. I was almost disappointed at first, but it's one of those things. So this is very much a movie that is like, it is basically it's like three distinct acts. The first act is the bureaucracy completely screwing up Godzilla growing. There's a very short sequence where Godzilla just goes and completely destroys Tokyo, uses all the flames, blasts planes out of the sky. It's pretty incredible. And then like the last hour of the movie, which I think is not nearly as fun as the first two, is a group of people finally coming together and actually doing something. So I don't know. There's a part of me that would have loved to have seen just this horrifically ugly Godzilla just be just be the main monster for the whole movie. I thought that would have been a very bold choice to be like, "Yep, this is Godzilla. Deal with it."
Yeah, and God, it's crazy because they really thought out the whole evolution process. I don't know if like a Dragon Ball type show has that kind of like influence because we know in Dragon Ball Z it's like Frieza, right? The character Frieza has these different forms, final form, tall Frieza form. You got the Goku and all the Saiyans that are like Super Saiyan 1, Super Saiyan 2. I don't know if that was an influence, but I felt like this was very like a Japanese type influence to do this like evolution type gimmick, and it worked for me because I was like, God, this is so disgusting. And originally, when you see the creature or Godzilla before he starts standing up and he's like dragging his head in the water, and he's just like kind of discovering like what the like you can tell like it's an animal discovering its new form and it's like getting used to itself, and then you feel so bad for it because it's just like it's an idiot. It's dumb. It's just digging his head in the water. It's causing chaos, but you can tell it's in pain because all of a sudden it starts bleeding all over the place, and you can tell like once he starts breathing oxygen, that chemical reaction in the body of Godzilla starts changing and it starts evolving. So I love that whole aspect to it of like science, and there's a very much scientific heavy feel to this movie as well, which I'll get into, but it's very much like Oppenheimer. But once it starts evolving, the whole bureaucracy thing gets even worse because it's like, oh shit, do we attack it? People want to save it, and you see like a quick 3-second shot of like an exterior shot, and there's like thousands of people protesting to keep Godzilla alive, and this is before he attacks. So it's like, oh man, what do you do? And of course, all that political red tape just kind of gets jumbled together, and finally, the prime minister starts doing these emergency declarations, which gives him emergency powers to start doing stuff, but it almost becomes too late. So what ends up happening is they put this scientific team together after Godzilla goes into the water. He goes away for a while before he comes back in his final form, and so it's like it's days and weeks in between. And the city's like on red alert all the time, and they bring all these scientists together. And as soon as this happens, I text Jerome. I'm like, dude, did Christopher Nolan just rip this off for Oppenheimer? Because it is the same vibe. It is the same approach. A group of scientists coming together, all of them with their weird kind of nerdy idiosyncrasies and weird like gimmicks they have being unique or whatever. And they all kind of come together to figure out what's going on. But God help me, I couldn't help but think of Oppenheimer.
I mean, I don't know. I know that Nolan obviously has his influences in terms of certain movies. Maybe just general monster movie vibes is what he was going for with Oppenheimer, but I'm definitely on the same wavelength in terms of saying Nolan treating a nuclear weapon like a monster makes a lot of sense because like that is the whole essence of the movie, that the monster is the atomic bomb. So I think that makes a lot of sense, and obviously Godzilla has a lot of clear you make the connections to the nuclear weapons, and in this case they're clearly trying to connect it to Fukushima and what happened in 2011, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And the first PM is so great, and the second one is even better. Like, he is just so completely hapless and useless, and I'm sorry that I'm not good with some of the names, but I mean, my God, this is just absolutely tremendous stuff. But yeah, I was totally impressed by a lot of this movie and just what they were able to execute. Like, this is a tough movie. There is a scenario where this movie doesn't work, and like the first hour drags and is really boring, and like just it doesn't work. And I'm not as huge of a fan of the second hour, but I think without that first hour, I think this movie is a dud. And I don't think it gets any praise, but it's perfectly edited. Like, for me, this is one of those movies where the editor is in fact the MVP because of what he is able to do in this case. So yeah, just kind of a miracle of a movie in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I love that it just kind of focuses on, like, you've had that criticism, like, monster movies don't focus on the humans too much, you just care about the monsters fighting. In this case, it's like the whole country is, like, in dire straits, and you kind of feel that tension and that desperation, because it really comes off, I think, especially with through the eyes of Yaguchi, Randa Yaguchi, and he's that young politician, and he's the one bringing everyone together and kind of like putting things into motion, and you can tell like he doesn't want this to go bad. Like he can see like the end game of Japan being totally destroyed, and he's trying to do everything in his power to stop that, which is why he does the Oppenheimer thing and brings the scientists together. But it gets kind of weird because there's starting to be U.S. involvement now, and there's this kind of like U.S. representative. She's both Japanese and American, and she's kind of, I guess she's trying to get the U.S. to help Japan in this situation. But of course, you help Japan out, you got to help us out. So there's kind of like this line there of like you have two countries trying to help each other out. But then, the problem is Godzilla wakes up and comes back and goes to Tokyo, and he's in like his fourth form now, and he's twice the size of what he was 30 minutes earlier. His tail is like extremely huge, which is a new feature for Godzilla, which I love because it was this new unique way to present Godzilla, and the giant tail just made it seem even more monstrous, like almost a tail, which we'll talk about at the end. We'll talk about that at the end, but his tail almost feels like another monster within himself. So that's what I loved about it. But of course, again, like they're about to attack it. They see some civilians, and they're like, the city's not totally evacuated. We can't attack. So of course, the prime minister doesn't want to hurt his image, so he doesn't attack when he should have attacked at that exact moment, probably. But he waited too late. And then once Godzilla started fighting back against like I think they were firing bombs at him at night. His body started to adapt and evolve again, right? So what happens? Something entirely new that blows my fucking mind every time. He grows lasers out of his spikes, and they're just as powerful as the atomic breath. And he just lays waste to like 8 or 9 planes in the sky, destroying buildings left and right. And it's just like the most incredible, powerful visual I've ever seen in any Godzilla movie, with that, operatic music in the background. It was just so powerful. And every time I saw it, or when I saw it in the theater the first time, I was just in awe. And then I would go online and try to find that clip over and over again until the Blu-ray came out. And then, man, just that scene. I love turning the lights down because it takes place at night. And we talk about CGI at night and doesn't always work, but in this case, it worked because the glowing lasers coming out of the spikes, and they're purple. So I kind of get why King Kong vs. Godzilla that came out a couple of years ago did the whole neon fight at night, because clearly they saw this movie and were like, oh, we can still do it at night. We just got to light it up really good. And in this case, they lit it up well, and it was just an incredible visual. The prime minister is dead, along with the top officials, and like it sucks because now the government is in shambles and chaos, and they have to get emergency people, in the right positions, and it's incredible. And what's more incredible is that Godzilla freezes up at that moment. You know what I mean? And he's just stuck there, and everyone's like, "What the fuck is going on?"
Well, he uses so much energy. Here's the thing: I will say, one of the things that I really appreciate, because usually the complaint when you use CGI in night scenes is that it looks very muddled and you can't quite make out what's happening. I think this is actually a situation where that is effective, because if the CGI doesn't totally work and you can't see anything, it doesn't matter as much, because the whole point of the scene is you're watching Godzilla destroy Tokyo. So you don't need to get into the minute details because you're not really invested in the people as much. So I think in that specific instance, doing it as a night scene actually helps the movie, and you can hide maybe some of the shortcomings of a budget. Another question I have for you, Brian. Did you ever see the movie Don't Look Up that was on Netflix?
No, my mom watched it, and she laughed her ass off until everyone died at the end, and she just laughed in a dark way at the end. I remember that.
So that is one of the most smug movies of all time, and I really don't like it. I think the movie is genuinely awful. It talks about a really important issue, but it just does it in literally the worst possible way. I think one of the key differences between that movie and this movie, why does this movie work? Why is this movie good? It's because they really focus on the bureaucracy. There's allusions to what is happening on the streets. You see people running on the streets, but we don't know those people. We don't get to know those people. There's also, you hear journalists' voice, but they're basically delivering exposition. They're not really characters in the movie. The people that we are focused on are the politicians, the people who have actual power, because then it becomes about the scientists as well. So I think this is a much more efficient story because of that, because you're focusing on one group. You really get to hone in on the bureaucracy, and therefore I think the joke, so to speak, works out so much better. Because, and the thing is, like, there's not a lot of jokes. The humor, I would say, is subtle, and you could very easily miss it because the humor is in a lot of the visuals and just seeing all of these people in the room. Like, that's the funny thing. And the lines they're saying, they're not jokes, but it's funny because they're not doing anything. So I compare that to Don't Look Up, because, again, Don't Look Up is just so in your face. It is punching you over the head with its metaphor. It's using a sledgehammer of doom. This movie is very, much more subtly, I would say, getting its message across. And for that, I think this is a much better film. This to me is, as you mentioned, very underrated by people. And I just think that it is an effective piece of storytelling because of the focus.
And I would say the prime example of what you're talking about is like whenever there's like a meeting with the prime minister, there's always this woman who's the leader of the defense who talks to this other guy who's like getting commands or giving commands to the people on the ground. So it's like he's giving her an answer and she's answering the same answer to the prime minister. And it's like, dude, just ask the guy over there. Why are you asking her in the middle? Like there's no point for a middleman in this situation. It's that kind of crazy bureaucracy. It's like, dude, what are we doing here? Like, why can't we just go directly message people as opposed to having these middlemen in between to message people the same fucking message? So it's like, it's frustrating, but that's the whole point of it. It's because I feel like there were so many times in this movie that they could have saved so many people, and like they just didn't act properly, and that's the frustrating part, and that's where that political satire comes in, and that's why I love this movie so much, is because they play with that. And you got the Yaguchi guy who's just so frustrated with it all because he sees that bullshit and he's trying to break that. And even at the end of the movie, he talks about how he sees himself as becoming prime minister one day, but only because he might be able to actually change things. You know what I mean? So that's one of those messages too, is about wiping it. Like the Godzilla is pretty much giving them a way to do a clean slate, unfortunately, in the most terrible way possible. But they mention kind of rebuilding at the end of the movie. So also want to mention this
So
movie.
one of the things that I want to know about Yaguchi specifically is, are they treating him like an actual, like, rising young politician in Japan, I wonder? And this is something that culturally we might not know the significance of. Is he meant to be that, or is he meant to be like an Obama stand-in? That's something that I
I'm not
was
sure
wondering.
because okay, I don't know if you know who this is, but he reminds me of current California Governor Gavin Newsom. Like he has that kind of like young kind of, okay, Gavin Newsom's not young, but younger than most politicians, but he's got that like spark. You know what I mean? That drive.
Right.
And I think that's what it is. It's like a combination of both. And that's why I really love his character in this movie. I think it's that the fact that he cares, and then he talks about like caring, and then at some points he kind of loses it. Like like he's yelling at like his cohorts, and is like, "What are we doing?" Like he starts yelling at him. We need to make a decision now, and they're telling him, "Just relax, relax. You're at your best when you're calm. You're being the actual leader in the situation. You just got to stay calm." So they were telling him like giving him the right support. So I like those little things during those meetings when he's almost about to lose it, and they're just trying to support him because he's the one holding everything together, it seems like. So I really like that fact. But one of the criticisms for me in this movie is that I think the dialogue with the scientist gets too techie and too scientific, jargony, to the point where I think the whole mystery about this Goro character that actually we never see, Goro Maki, almost becomes like a red herring to the point where it's almost not necessary, because it kind of it's basically adding to the mystery of like, what did this guy know about Godzilla that was hiding or whatever, that he hid this information or blah blah blah. And it turns out he kind of found out about the political, or about the nuclear waste dumping and how that can affect that area, and if a certain sea creature from that area gets affected, and like what's the cause and effect of all this. And so basically he had all this information about Godzilla before Godzilla even was created. So that's where I'm a little like, okay, this is a little too much. Like you didn't have to do all that, but they wanted to make it more of like a scientific explanation. Because what they're basically trying to say is that this version of Godzilla is always going to be evolving no matter what, and that's kind of what I guess the metaphor of the origami was, because basically Goro left his notes in like this weird chart-like pattern hand drawn, and people couldn't figure it out. And then one of the scientists, one of my favorite scientists in that group, he's always wearing a towel. He's always wearing a towel around his neck. I love that guy. But he figures out it's like an origami thing, so he folds it like an origami, and he starts noticing that once the paper moves, so does the DNA molecules and the structure, and they start to realize that Godzilla's evolving to the point where it could even like evolve with wings or something like that. So there's like it's unlimited godlike potential, and at that point they realize, okay, we really got to stop this thing, and so they come up with this idea of a coagulant to freeze it. It's a little, again, the scientific jargon of this maybe not even accurate at all, probably, but they figure like we can just kind of freeze it. But then the problem is the U.S. gives them a deadline. Listen, we're giving you 2 weeks, otherwise we're dropping a nuke. And this is where I feel like it gets even more emotional, because once all the characters start finding out that the U.S. is about to drop a nuke again, like the tone just changes and it just becomes this dark thing where it's like, oh my god, they're gonna bomb us again. You know what I mean? It's like, especially the one dude at the table, he starts crying and slaps the fucking table. He's like, this is going too far. They can't do this to us again. And it's like, God, I know, like that would be the worst possible decision, I think. And it just gets really like, oh my God, we got to stop this now. So everyone's like frantic. We gotta do this before the U.S. does this. And so everyone's kind of like freaking out. They don't know if they should even like evacuate Tokyo at this point because of their plan to freeze Godzilla. But man, I felt like at this part, like things really escalated, and I felt like the emotional and like all that drama just escalated to a different level where it became this cultural thing where it's like now they're going to be haunted by their past again. It's like how can the U.S. do this to us?
Oh yeah, I think I mean I can't put myself in the perspective of a Japanese citizen, but I can't imagine a scenario where that it's just got to be so it's got to be so tough because Japan is the only country where an atomic bomb has ever been dropped with the intention of committing an atrocity, and the United States is the only country that has ever dropped a bomb in wartime and just beyond the idea of testing. I mean, and that's, you're playing with some really loaded imagery, and I think they handled it incredibly well. And I think what you're mentioning in terms of the dialogue getting a little bit esoteric, I think that's where I think the movie falters for me a little bit, not too much, because I don't think the second hour is bad. I just think that the first hour is just so incredibly well executed that almost nothing they could do, because you have to have some form of resolution. You can't have 2 hours of just this. You have to do something eventually, but almost no matter what they would do in the second hour, it wouldn't compare, because again, this is not the kind of movie where you are going to have like an action-packed finale. Like, you're going to do something that matches up with the tone of the first one. So you're going to do something that's more cerebral, more scientifically based, and you're going to come up with a solution that doesn't involve, just shooting it a bunch or killing it. So I think they did about as good of a job as you could do resolving the situation. But yeah, I mean, again, the second hour isn't as good, but still, this is still a movie that is very much worthwhile.
And I think it's a movie that's very aware of like the tone and what the messages are coming across the screen. Like I think it's very self-aware to the point where once they make that announcement to the audience that they got like 2 weeks, it becomes like, oh my god, this tone, the tone of the movie just completely changes, and it becomes like this depressing, sad tone. And it's like this desperate thing, like, oh my god, we're so frantic, we gotta do this now. They end up freezing Godzilla, man, and it actually the plan works. And it's kind of, again, they play with the imagery on purpose, and I didn't notice at all. But once you look at the notes, like it's, yeah, the things they use to get the coagulant in Godzilla, very similar to when they were, trying to get to these places that were affected by the Fukushima radiation and trying to like clean it, like that kind of imagery they use specifically. So they knew what they were doing in terms of like picking ways to use certain like the trucks. How can we incorporate the trucks to give it that visual imagery again? And coagulant, boom. So they freeze it, and basically what basically what Yuguchi says is that we have to learn to live with Godzilla. It's a new era in mankind, and we can't just kill him. You know what I mean? We have to learn to live with him because the fear is that they can't kill him, right? And I think that's what the whole point of the DNA structure thing was, to show that Godzilla might not be able to die, folks, and he might just keep evolving and evolving. And they froze him at the right time because they feared that the next like evolutionary stage was going to be, uh, procreation and like reproducing. And if you look at that last shot of the movie, there are actual humanoid monsters growing out of his tail. Which, when I saw that in the theater for the first time, and they only show for 3 seconds, I thought I'd like was like high or something like, because I had definitely smoked the joint before I watched the movie. But I was just like, what the fuck did I just see? Was that real? Did you see that? And then I went online and it was totally real. And the idea is that the fifth evolution would have been humanoid monsters evolving from his tail and taking over the planet, man. So luckily they froze him at the right time. But man, did that ending kind of have the same effect on you? Did you even notice what was going on with his tail, or even why they showed the tail at all?
I mean, it was pretty. It was a very striking visual. I couldn't really tell what was going on there, but there's a number of different theories. I think you could kind of take it in your own direction. This is a tough movie because on the one hand, you know that Godzilla is going to live in perpetuity. So it is both unfortunate that we have not gotten a sequel to this movie, but it's also probably a blessing because do we really need another movie to explain the lore of the tale? We really, really don't. This movie, if it exists by itself, is probably for the best. But I think it was a tremendous visual, and I think just leaving it to people's devices, sometimes you don't need to explore every nook and cranny in a universe. Star Wars, I'm looking at you.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, so that ending kind of freaked me out, man, but it just kind of shows you that this Godzilla is constantly evolving and adapting and changing. So I love that whole aspect to it. And we only saw Godzilla on screen for what, 15 minutes, maybe less. So, but
If that, 15 minutes, if that.
but I love the fact that he's like in the background of like a lot of shots at the end, and it's just such a striking visual, especially the end where you see Yaguchi and that the U.S. Japanese woman who's like that, the liaison to the U.S. and Japan, and they're both standing there in the foreground, and the background is that giant Godzilla frozen. Just a striking visual because again, it's daytime, and they're treating it like it's a normal shot, like that's just a normal background, even though Godzilla's in the background frozen. So I thought it's almost like the new norm, and they're all getting used to it, and they're trying to, let's say, like, yeah, it's the new norm. Tokyo's just gonna have Godzilla frozen in the middle from now on, and we're gonna have to freeze him for like all the time until we can figure out an answer. But yeah, that's kind of the ending. So it's kind of a hopeful ending because they talk about rebirth and remaking things. But a quick little note. So there's that character, Akasaka, who's kind of like middle aged and he's got the glasses. You know what I'm talking about? Who's kind of the advisor to everybody.
Yes.
Okay, so he's actually appeared in other Shin titles, like because there's like Kamen Rider and Ultraman, all these different properties, right, in Japan, owned by
Yeah,
Toho, I
this
think.
movie really made me want to go watch Shin Ultraman, which is on Amazon, so I may do that at some point.
Which is crazy because I'm not even the biggest Ultraman fan. Ultraman is not even in the same universe as Godzilla. It's like Ultraman is like an alien that fights these giant aliens that are sent from this planet to destroy Earth, and it's every episode is different. But in this case, he's set, like, according to him, because he's in Kamen Rider and he's in Ultraman, and he claims that he's playing the same person in every one, even though it's officially not true. So technically, I guess this is part of the Shin universe, even though Shin Kamen Rider and Shin Ultraman are just standalone stories that don't overconnect or anything at all, because especially since I think they're owned by different properties. But I just find it fascinating that they got this guy to come in to almost play the exact same character in each one, just to kind of make you feel like, oh my God, is this connected? But it's got me interested. I've seen Ultraman episodes, but I kind of burn out after like 3 or 4 because it's so repetitive that I end up just watching another Godzilla movie after that. So Ultraman is hit and miss for me, especially with like the history of it. But I found it fascinating that they try to tie all these Shin titles together. But yeah, other than that, I think I definitely don't need a sequel. I think when this came out, I definitely was ready for it. But then after a while, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, maybe we don't really need it, because then if the tail, you talk about the tail, like what's the focus on that? What's the story on that? And if you can't write a story about a tail with humanoids growing out of it, what's the point? So they kind of went back to the drawing board, and that's where -1 comes in. So the whole concept of Godzilla -1 really quickly is that it takes place right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, like right after. And so I guess the idea is that those bombs had something to do with maybe waking Godzilla up or something. We don't know all the details, but this is the first Godzilla movie to take place in the 40s, like really right after the bombings. So I'm really looking forward to that, because that's a different approach than the original 54 version for sure. So I'm really looking forward to that and how they approach that. There was rumblings that there's somehow connections between Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1 coming up, but I think that was just kind of a translation issue, because there's no way you can tie history of those two movies together, because then people will be like, okay, so Godzilla comes out in 2016. How come if no one acknowledges the fact that there was another Godzilla in 48 or whatever? So I'm glad they kind of kiboshed that and didn't tie them together, because it would have made no sense. So it looks like they're doing that thing where they're making individual Godzilla movies again, not necessarily tying together, which I'm fine with. But I do enjoy like the continuity of the 80s and 90s movies that run had. So, I do like good continuity now and then, but not everything has to be an MCU style universe. So I get that. But overall, this gets an 8.5 out of 10 for me. I think the script is fantastic and the approach is so different. The cinematography is great. And the way they save money on the effects, and it's a $15 million budget, and just making it so modern and relevant. You know what I mean? And just a totally different approach that to this day, I think no other monster movie has done, nor has the balls to even do. But I don't know. We'll see if this kind of inspires some filmmakers, because this was 2016. All the monster movies that have come out since then, not nearly as good as this. So I don't know. It's going to be very tough. But and of course, the evolution of Godzilla throughout the movie is just tremendous, from being this like tadpole like creature and evolving and bleeding all over the place, to standing up, to having atomic breath, to having humanoids grow out of his tail. So just a tremendous visual all around, and how he's disgusting. And then we get the regular Godzilla at the end. But overall, man, I love this movie a lot, and I'm so glad you're on board with me now. As soon as you told me your rating after you watched it, I gave you that virtual hug. But I'm virtually hugging you right now.
Yes, 8 out of 10 for me. I think this movie was really good. I think we're in general agreement on most aspects of it. So, yeah, just tremendously impressive. And this is probably going to go down as my definitive favorite Godzilla movie. It is so much better than the 1998 version with Matthew Broderick, which we will never speak of again. God, that movie was bad.
They're releasing it on 4K in a couple months, so I don't know. And I just got a
I don't know
PlayStation 5.
why. I heard that too. Didn't one of the Japanese Godzilla movies murder straight up the 1998 Godzilla?
Yes, I've seen that movie. That movie's Godzilla Final Wars. They use the same rendering as the 1998 Godzilla, and he killed him in Australia. But again, Final Wars, definitely one of my bottom 5 Godzilla movies.
Was that one of those situations where they jobbed him out, so to speak? Like,
yeah, it was basically all these monsters were attacking all over the world. The Godzilla from '98 was attacking Australia. Godzilla shows up and kills him in less than 10 seconds, actually. So
this is like when the WWF would bring Dusty Rhodes and give him polka dots, or give Harley Race a crown. It's the same equivalent.
He got worse treatment than that. Like,
I don't know, man. Dusty Rhodes and polka dots is pretty bad.
Did not even get a punch in that movie. So. But yeah, if you want to check out like all the history of Godzilla stuff, like look it up. I mean, a lot of the movies are crap, but some of them are really fun. Some I think take this like like a nature approach, like a Mother Earth type approach. Nature. Those are usually the Mothra movies, which I think highly of. I love the character Mothra. But if I were to recommend one, it'd probably be Mothra versus Godzilla from like 1963, where that has a very like environmental message and like Mother Earth and protecting the Earth and that kind of thing. So other than that, if you want to just see monsters fight each other, definitely check out the classic era and all that kind of thing, and the 90s era. But there are some that kind of stick out, you know what I mean? Like the original, this one, like I mentioned, the one with Mothra. I love the original with King Kong, and that kind of set the standard for me in terms of like the versus series of like Godzilla fighting a monster. That kind of set the tone of what that era was. So there's some fun ones out there, but definitely some duds for sure. But again, I can teach a whole class on Godzilla. But other than that, I think we're pretty much in agreement on this movie. I'm glad Jerome was on board. I'm so glad we did this month because it turns out this month was very well booked considering the Meg came out. We got a Godzilla
It
movie.
was certainly much better than Brendan Fraser month, which was kind of a disaster. This is definitely better.
Well, at least Brendan Fraser won the Oscar, so that's the consolation prize on that one. And I would say this is probably the best month I've booked since the John Carpenter month from a few years ago. So I think I did a good job on this one, especially with all the tie-ins and especially with the Meg coming out. I thought that was just perfect timing. And of course, Clint Curtis, whatever, from last week's episode. So a lot of connections. But overall, I think we had a fun month, and my MVP is going to be Hideki Ono and Shinji Higuchi, the co-directors, and best performance Hiroki Hasegawa uh, as Yaguchi, the young politician. But overall, very very awesome movie, underrated, 8.5 out of 10.
So Hideki Anno is also credited as one of the editors of the movie, so I'm going to give it to him as well. I'm also going to give it to Atsuki Sato, who is the other credited editor. I think they did a masterful job in terms of putting this movie together. I mean, look, I don't know that we've ever given the editors the MVP, and maybe we should, but for my money, I think this is a great job for the editors, and I'm going to agree with you on the best performance. I mean, really, this movie is really not about the performances, which is kind of fitting. In that way, it is the monster movie. So much of this is about the writing. But in reality, if the performers are not speaking quickly, like, the movie doesn't work. But also the performances the performances both matter, and they don't matter at the same time because you're invested in the rhythm of the movie. You're not as invested in the characters. So it's just funny how this, in many ways, is an anti-monster movie, but in a lot of ways has a lot of similarities because we still are not as invested as the characters like we would be in a regular movie.
Yeah, and I love the whole Oppenheimer connections as well. Like, I know the joke was that Oppenheimer is the prequel to every single Godzilla movie. And in this case, like, it actually fit this movie because they did the whole Oppenheimer thing of getting the scientists together in the middle of the movie. So I thought just so many connections. And I know Christopher Nolan deep down loves these blockbuster type movies, and I'm sure he's watched a handful of Godzilla movies. And I tend to think that he watched Shin Godzilla and got a good inspiration from that to do Oppenheimer's. That's just my opinion. I'm probably wrong, but you never know these days. But yeah, what a month that I booked, and I'm glad that everything kind of came together, and I'm glad that Jerome discovered Tremors for the first time. We both discovered Deep Rising for the first time. Jerome finally got to watch this movie. We finally got to talk about Robert Forster. So a lot of great stuff in this month overall. But we're kind of making a switch for next month. We're switching up some plans. We're making some audibles, but I think Jerome can explain it better of what we're doing in the next month.
So, for reasons that we will get into very soon, once I have permission, we are going to be doing a 13 episode run, a big run of things that we have always wanted to do, or maybe things that we should be doing, but we're not going to do Superhero Pantheon until next year when we were going to do a run. That plan has changed because we are going to do between 10 and 13 episodes of Superhero Pantheon. We are also going to be doing a couple of specials as well come December. But just know that for October and November, guaranteed, we will be returning to Superhero Pantheon for a last ride, so to speak. And I am very excited to be getting into this. We have a nice list of things to get through, and we've also made some decisions about certain movies. Like, there have been a lot of superhero movies that have come out the last couple of years. We will not be doing individual episodes about all of them. We're really going to be covering, like, movies that we think are either deserving of their own episode or are likely to be considered for the Superhero Pantheon. We don't have anything that will be considered for the pile of shame, so that's a good thing. But there are definitely some movies on our list that we think will get into the Pantheon, so we will be covering those. So yeah, we'll get into that next week.
And I'll just say this, I think it's perfect timing for Loki Season 2, and that's the little preview I'm going to give. And I got myself the sweet and sour sauce with low-key logo on it from McDonald's. I'm never going to open that. So if anyone's interested, hit me up because I'll probably sell it to you for a high amount of money that it's definitely not worth. So kind of wrapping things up. Thank you for listening to this whole month. I loved this whole month concept. I love monster movies. I love kaiju movies, whatever you want to call them. So I really appreciate you guys listening. And we'll talk to you again next week.
Fuck it, Brian. Next week, the Snyder Cut.